What happens when the man who commands the legions of Rome, the man whose whisper can destroy cities and whose signature can end thousands of lives, finds himself utterly helpless against the silence of his own body? How much gold would you pay? How many provinces would you trade just to perform the single, simple act that every beggar in the street takes for granted? It is a death that history books often whisper about, too grotesque for polite conversation, yet it destroyed the most feared tyrant of the ancient world. It begins not with a scream, but with a pressure that simply refuses to go away. It wasn't a scene from a twisted mythological nightmare. It was the cold, hard reality inside the imperial palace of Serdica in the spring of 311 AD. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine. The guards stood like statues of bronze, but the air was thick with a terror that no sword could fight. This is the story of Gaius Galerius Valerius Maximianus, Emperor of the East, the Iron Shepherd, the scourge of the Christians. He believed he was chosen by the gods to rule the world, but something else had chosen him, something ancient, microscopic, and patient. Before we dive into this darkness, hit like if you are ready to witness history's most brutal medical mystery. Now. Lights out, the 40-day siege began in silence. In the heart of the imperial bedchamber, the air was heavy, suffocatingly hot, and perfumed with an aggressive amount of frankincense and burning cedar. The smoke curled toward the high vaulted ceilings, a desperate, hazy barrier erected by the attendants. They were trying to mask a smell that had not yet arrived, but which they all feared was coming. Galerius lay upon a bed frame carved from the finest cedar of Lebanon, draped in silks dyed with Tyrian purple, cloth worth more than the weight of the men guarding his door. He was a massive man. Even in repose, his frame was intimidating. He was built like a bull, with a thick neck and a chest barrel chested from decades of wearing heavy Roman Larica segmentata armor. He was the Iron Shepherd, the soldier emperor who had risen from the mud of Dacia to the throne of the Caesars. He had marched across the Euphrates. He had sacked the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, and he had looked the King of Kings in the eye without blinking. But now, he could not look at his own physician. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic, labored breathing of the emperor and the distant, muffled footsteps of slaves pacing in the corridor outside. It was the 40th day, or perhaps the 41st. Time had begun to blur into a singular, agonizing continuum of pressure. Galerius shifted his weight. The silk rustled, a sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. A grimace tightened his jaw, the muscles bunching beneath a beard that was now flecked with gray and matted with sweat. His hand, thick-fingered and calloused from the grip of a gladius, moved instinctively to his abdomen. It hovered there, trembling slightly, afraid to touch the source of his torment. He felt full, not the satisfaction of a feast, but the terrifying solidity of stone. It was as if he had swallowed a cannonball that was slowly heating up, expanding, pressing against the delicate membranes of his inner world. The plumbing of the human body is a miracle of biological engineering, a system of flow and release. But when that flow stops, the body ceases to be a vessel of life and becomes a sealed pressure cooker. To the physicians huddled in the corner, speaking in hushed Greek, the emperor was a paradox. He was the most powerful man on earth. He could order a river diverted. He could order a mountain leveled for a road. Yet, he could not order his own bowels to move. The imperial command structure, so absolute across the provinces of the East, held no sway over the biology of the man who sat at its pinnacle. The sensation was maddening. It was a dull ache that radiated from his lower abdomen, wrapping around his hips like a vise of hot iron. It was a phantom weight, dragging him down into the mattress. Every breath required effort, as the diaphragm pushed down against the distended mass of his intestines, finding no room to move. "Water," Galerius croaked. His voice, once a thunderclap that could rally a legion, was now a dry rattle. A young slave boy, terrified, approached with a silver goblet. The condensation on the metal promised coolness, relief. Galerius drank. But the water did not bring relief. It only added to the volume, the pressure, the tightness. He could feel the liquid trickle down, only to hit the blockade, joining the stagnant accumulation that was slowly poisoning him from the inside out. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the darkness behind his eyelids was red. He remembered the campaigns in Persia. He remembered the heat of the desert, the smell of blood and dust. He had seen men die in every way imaginable. He had seen them gutted by spears, trampled by war elephants, wasted by dysentery in the camp latrines. He had always believed that when his time came, it would be violent and glorious, a soldier's death. He never imagined he would die like this, bloated, helpless, a prisoner in his own skin. The pressure spiked. A sharp, jagged lance of pain shot up his spine, causing his entire body to spasm. The physicians rushed forward, their robes fluttering like the wings of carrion birds. They hovered, useless, their hands hovering over instruments of bronze and iron that they were too afraid to use. They knew the anatomy of the human body, or so they claimed. They spoke of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. They debated whether the emperor was suffering from an excess of black bile, a melancholic stagnation that had turned the contents of his body into stone. "My lord," the chief physician whispered, his face pale in the flickering lamplight. We must attempt the poultice again, the figs and the warm oil." Galerius stared at the ceiling. The poultice. They had tried the poultice for 10 days. They had tried emetics to make him vomit. They had tried purgatives that would have killed a horse. Nothing moved. The blockage was absolute. "Do it," Galerius hissed through gritted teeth. "And if it fails again, prepare the knife." The room went cold. The knife. Surgery on the torso was a death sentence in the ancient world. Without anesthesia, without antiseptics, opening the abdominal cavity was to invite the demons of infection directly into the citadel of the soul. But Galerius was a man who understood tactics. When the walls are breached, when the enemy is inside the gate, you do not negotiate. You burn the city to save the citadel. But the enemy wasn't just inside the gate. The enemy was the gate. As the physicians prepared the warm oil, the emperor felt a shift. It wasn't movement. It was a tearing. Deep inside the complex, winding darkness of his lower tract, the tissue, stretched beyond the capacity of human endurance, was beginning to fail. The blood flow, cut off by the immense internal pressure, had stopped days ago. The tissue was dying. Necrosis had set in, silent and black, rotting the emperor while he still breathed. The tension in the room was palpable, vibrating like a bowstring pulled too tight. The invisible assassin was no longer lurking in the shadows. It had the knife at his throat. The constipation, the blockage, was merely the first stage of the siege. The walls were about to crumble. Galerius gripped the sheets, his knuckles white. The pain transformed. It was no longer a dull ache. It was a searing, burning fire, as if he had swallowed live coals. The explosion was imminent. Not a detonation of gunpowder, but the catastrophic rupture of the human vessel. The barrier between the waist and the blood was dissolving. He looked at the physician, and in the eyes of the learned man, Galerius saw something worse than fear. He saw pity. The master of the world, the Augustus of the East, was dissolving into a puddle of his own making. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. He had spent his life purging the empire of what he called moral filth, referring to the Christians. Now the filth was trapping him, consuming him. The lights, Galerius whispered, his vision blurring as the toxins began to flood his bloodstream. Why are the lights so dim? They weren't dim. The sun was blazing over Serdica. But for Galerius, the long night was beginning. The pressure in his abdomen gave one final, agonizing throb, a heartbeat of pure agony that eclipsed all thought, all reason, all power. The dam was about to break. To understand the horror of the rotting, one must first understand the magnificence of the vessel that contained it. Before the stench of the sick room, there was the smell of wet earth, pine resin, and the coppery tang of fresh blood on the wind. Decades earlier, far from the marble halls of Serdica, the man who would become the master of the East was nothing more than a boy in the mud. They called him Armentarius, the herdsman. Born in the rugged, unforgiving hinterlands of Dacia Aureliana, along the banks of the Danube, young Galerius did not grow up swaddled in silk. He grew up wrestling calves and breaking the necks of wolves that dared to stray too close to his flock. The mountains of Dacia forge men of iron. The winters there are long and cruel. The winds bite like frosted daggers, and the summers are choked with dust. Galerius was carved from this landscape. He was a creature of biological surplus, too tall, too broad, too loud. His hands were not made for quills or scrolls. They were made to grip the thick wool of a struggling ram or the haft of a heavy axe. When he joined the legions, the Roman military machine did not need to teach him how to endure pain. It only needed to teach him where to direct it. He rose through the ranks not by lineage or political maneuvering, but by the sheer, undeniable violence of his existence. He was a force of nature. Soldiers followed him because he looked like he could eat the enemy alive. He marched with the same pack weight as the lowest legionary, ate the same hardtack and vinegar, and slept on the same frozen ground. His body was a temple of endurance. He survived dysentery in the swamps, arrow wounds in the shoulders, and the crushing fatigue of forced marches that left lesser men dead by the roadside. To his men, he was the Iron Shepherd. He herded them towards glory with the tip of a spear. The apex of his physical dominance came in the war against the Sassanid Empire. The Persians were the ancient enemy, the dragon in the east. Their king, Narse, was a monarch of gold and jewels, leading an army of immortals and war elephants. Galerius faced them with the grit of the Danube. Picture the scene on the banks of the Tigris. The air is thick with the heat of Mesopotamia, distorting the horizon. Galerius, clad in muscle cuirass, stands at the head of the formation. He is not hiding in a tent. He is screaming orders, his voice booming over the clash of 10,000 shields. When the Roman lines broke the Persian defense, it was Galerius who surged forward. He sacked Ctesiphon, the jewel of the Orient. He captured the harem of the Persian king, seizing wealth beyond the comprehension of a simple herdsman. He returned to Rome not just as a victor, but as a demigod. He was the Caesar of the East, the right hand of Emperor Diocletian. He stood on the rostrum, his chest heaving with pride, his skin bronzed by the sun, his muscles coiled like steel cables. He felt the surge of adrenaline, the drug of absolute power coursing through veins that had never known sickness. He looked at his own body with a kind of religious reverence. It was perfect. It was an engine of conquest. He believed that the gods, Mars, Jupiter, Mithras, favored him because of this strength. Weakness was a moral failing. Sickness was for the poor, the cowardly, the soft. He had no concept of the microscopic rebellion waiting in his own gut. In those years of glory, Galerius ate like a wolf. He consumed vast quantities of red meat, washed down with heavy, unwatered wine. He feasted on rich, fatty boars roasted whole, their skins crackling with grease. He gorged on pheasants and venison, the diet of a conqueror. He ignored the warnings of physicians who spoke of balance and moderation. Moderation was for men who did not rule the world. He built a reality where he was the hardest thing in existence. He was the hammer, and the world was the anvil. But iron has a flaw. Iron is strong, rigid, unyielding. But when iron is exposed to the elements, when it is neglected, it does not bend. It rusts. It corrodes from the inside, flaking away until the structural integrity is gone. As the years passed, the muscle turned to bulk. The hardtack was replaced entirely by the banquet. The marches stopped, replaced by the sedan chair. The shepherd put down his staff and picked up the goblet. The biology that had once allowed him to wrestle wolves was now turning inward. The massive frame that terrified the Persians was becoming a cage. Flash forward to the bedchamber in Serdica. The memory of the sun-drenched victory at Ctesiphon fades into the gray, oppressive twilight of the sick room. The body on the bed is still massive, but it is a ruin. The chest that once swelled with the roar of command now heaves with the shallow panic of suffocation. The legs that marched across continents are swollen, useless logs. The Iron Shepherd had forgotten the first rule of the herdsman. You must tend to the flock, or the flock will sicken. He had neglected the flock of his own cells, and now the wolf was not at the door. The wolf was already inside, chewing through the very gut that had digested the spoils of an empire. The invincibility was a lie, the armor was off, and the man of iron was about to learn that flesh, no matter how strong, is always, always edible. The year was 303 AD. The empire was stable, the borders secure, and the treasury full. But Galerius was not satisfied with peace. In his mind, a silent cancer was already eating away at the soul of Rome. Long before the physical cancer would come for his body, he looked out from the porticos of his palace in Nicomedia and saw a threat greater than the Persian elephants. He saw Christians. To the modern mind, the persecution of a religious group might seem like a political maneuver. To Galerius, it was a matter of cosmic hygiene. He was a traditionalist, a man who believed the favor of the gods was a transaction. Rome offers sacrifice, and the gods offer victory. But the Christians refused the transaction. They refused to burn incense to Jupiter. They refused to bow to the genius of the emperor. They were a clog in the spiritual plumbing of the empire, a blockage that stopped the flow of divine favor. Galerius, the man who would soon die from a blockage in his own body, became obsessed with removing this blockage from the state. He went to his senior emperor, Diocletian, an old, tired man who just wanted to grow cabbages in retirement. Galerius whispered poison in his ear. He spoke of soldiers refusing to fight because of their peaceful god. He spoke of omens going sour, of the oracles falling silent because atheists, as the Christians were called, were present in the court. "We must cut them out," Galerius urged, his voice low and intense, his massive hands crushing a grape on the table. Like a gangrenous limb, if we do not amputate, the infection will spread. The irony of his metaphor would echo through the years, bouncing off the walls of his future deathbed. Diocletian hesitated, but the Iron Shepherd was relentless. He staged incidents. A fire broke out in the imperial palace, twice. Galerius pointed a thick finger at the Christians. "They are burning us out," he roared. "They are the enemies of Rome." Thus began the Great Persecution. It was not a war, it was a slaughter. Edicts were issued, churches were razed to the ground, the stone foundations dug up as if to erase the very memory of their existence. Sacred scriptures were burned in public squares, the parchment curling and blackening in the flames. Bishops were rounded up, thrown into dungeons so crowded that criminals had to be released to make room for the clergy. But Galerius wanted more than silence. He wanted submission. The tortures devised under his watch were not merely cruel. They were inventive, industrial. Men were suspended by one hand, their joints dislocated, while their feet were burned over slow fires. Women were stripped and dragged through the streets. The Iron Shepherd treated the population like rebellious cattle that needed to be broken. One particular method of execution stood out, haunting in its foreshadowing. Christians were sometimes tied to chairs and slowly roasted over gridirons, their flesh cooking while they were still alive. Galerius would watch these spectacles with a grim satisfaction, believing he was purifying the empire with fire. He smelled the burning flesh of the martyrs and called it the sweet aroma of justice. He did not know that the smell of cooking meat would return to him. He did not know that his own body would eventually mimic the very agony he inflicted. As the years of persecution dragged on, the Christians did not break. They sang hymns in the flames. They smiled at their executioners. This infuriated Galerius. Their resilience was a direct challenge to his power. How could these weak, unarmed people possess a strength that his legions could not crush? The psychological toll began to mount. Galerius grew paranoid, irritable. He saw enemies in shadows. He ate more, drank more, trying to drown the frustration. The stress of the persecution, the constant anger, the cortisol flooding his system, it all fed into the metabolic disaster brewing in his gut. By 310 AD, the persecution had failed. The prisons were full, the graveyards were overflowing, but the Christians were still there. And Galerius was changing. He was heavier now. His face was puffy, his eyes yellowed with the early signs of liver distress. He would sit on his throne, shifting uncomfortable, feeling the first twinges of the pressure that would soon define his existence. The Christians, hiding in catacombs and whispering in back alleys, began to pray. They did not pray for his death. That was too simple. They prayed for judgment. They cited the stories of the Old Testament, of Herod eaten by worms, of Antiochus whose flesh fell from his bones. They whispered that the God of the martyrs was slow to anger, but terrible in his wrath. Galerius laughed at their stories. "Your God is a carpenter," he sneered. "I am the Augustus." But the transaction with the gods was about to be balanced. He had offered them blood, rivers of it. Now the gods, or perhaps just biology, or perhaps the God he mocked, were preparing to return the favor. The bill for the Great Persecution was coming due, and it would not be paid in gold. It would be paid in flesh. In the winter of 310, as the smoke of the last burning church drifted over the city, Galerius felt a sharp pain in his groin. He ignored it. It was just an itch, a minor irritation. It was the first knock at the door. The year 311 AD dawned cold and gray over the eastern provinces. Galerius, now the supreme Augustus, was preparing for the celebrations of his 20th year in power, his Vicenalia. It was meant to be a festival of triumph, a reaffirmation of his iron grip on the world. But the celebration never happened. The first warning did not come as a thunderclap. It wasn't a sudden collapse in the Senate or a stroke during a banquet. It was humiliatingly banal. It was an ulcer. It began in the most private, sensitive region of his body, his genitals. Initially, it was a small, insistent inflammation. To a man who had taken spear thrusts and sword cuts, this was nothing. A nuisance. He dismissed it as a chafing from his saddle, or perhaps the result of the heavy, rich fabrics he wore. He applied a simple salve, grunted in annoyance, and continued his administrative duties. But the body keeps the score, and Galerius's body was losing. Within weeks, the irritation had mutated. The swelling did not recede, it expanded. The skin, once tough and bronzed, became taut, shiny, and angry red. The inflammation burrowed deeper, invading the delicate tissue of the urethra. Urinating became a trial of endurance. At first, it was a sting, then a burn, then a razor-wire agony that made the Emperor of Rome grip the marble pillars of his bathhouse until his knuckles cracked. The flow of water, the most basic function of life, was being strangled. Physicians were summoned quietly. This was not a wound of war that could be displayed with pride. This was a shameful affliction. They arrived at night, entering through the servants' quarters. They examined the Augustus in the flickering light of oil lamps, their faces masked to hide their revulsion. A stoppage of the humors, one declared, stroking his beard. An imbalance of heat, another argued. They prescribed diets of bland gruel. They applied leeches to his inner thighs, the small black slugs growing fat on imperial blood. But the swelling only worsened. Then came the hunger. Not a hunger for food. Galerius had lost his appetite weeks ago, but a metabolic hunger. His body, fighting a war against an unseen infection, began to consume itself. He burned with fever. His massive frame, once solid muscle and fat, began to change. The fat didn't disappear. It seemed to curdle. The real horror, however, was the immobility. The swelling in his lower body became so severe that his legs could no longer support him. The Iron Shepherd was grounded. He was confined to his bed, forcing him to lie still while the pressure inside him built. And then, the internal plumbing failed completely. The ulceration had caused strictures, scar tissue and swelling that clamped shut the exit routes of the body. The bowels, sluggish from years of rich diet and lack of fiber, simply stopped moving. This is where the medical nightmare truly began. Consider the biology. The human body produces waste constantly. It is a factory that never closes. When the loading dock is sealed, the factory does not stop producing. It simply fills up. Galerius began to bloat. It was a slow, inexorable expansion. His abdomen grew tight as a drum. The pain was no longer localized to his groin. It was a systemic, crushing pressure that radiated into his back, his chest, his lungs. The physicians were now panicked. They knew that if the blockage wasn't cleared, the emperor would die of toxicity. The waste would poison his blood. They tried everything in the ancient medical toolkit. They administered enemas of honey and oil using bronze syringes. Nothing returned but blood. They forced him to drink concoctions of hellebore, a toxic plant used as a violent purgative. It made him retch until he burst blood vessels in his eyes, but the blockage below remained solid. They massaged his stomach, their hands pressing deep into the distended flesh, trying to manually force the movement. Galerius screamed. The man who had laughed at the torture of Christians was now screaming like a child. It was during one of these sessions that the physicians noticed the smell. It wasn't just the smell of sickness or unwashed sheets. It was something sweeter, cloying, and infinitely more terrifying. It was the smell of fermentation. Inside the emperor, the trapped matter was rotting. Bacteria were feasting on the stagnant waste, producing gas. This gas had nowhere to go. It inflated his intestines, stretching them to the point of translucence. He was becoming a human balloon. Galerius could feel it. He could feel the bubbles of gas moving inside him, trapped, rolling like marbles under his skin. He felt distinct pops and shifts that sent waves of nausea through him. He looked at his physicians with wild yellow eyes. "Cut it out," he wheezed. "Cut it out of me." The physicians exchanged glances. Surgery on the genitals, surgery on the bowels. In 311 AD, it was madness. The infection rate was nearly 100%. To cut him was to kill him. But to do nothing was to watch him explode. The lead physician, a Greek named Solon, stepped forward. His hands were shaking. He held a scalpel of obsidian, sharper than steel. "We must drain the accumulation, Dominus," Solon whispered. "But the risk." "I am the risk," Galerius roared, though it came out as a gurgle. "Do it!" Solon nodded. He signaled to the slaves. "Hold him down. Hold him down with everything you have." There was no opium. There was no ether. There was only the grip of the guards, a piece of leather for the emperor to bite, and the cold, black edge of the knife. The first warning was over. The butchery was about to begin. The room was stripped of luxury. The silk sheets were replaced with rough linen that could be burned later. The air was thick with the scent of vinegar and burnt wool, an ancient attempt to sterilize the slaughterhouse. Galerius lay on his back, his massive legs splayed and tied to the bedposts with thick leather straps. 4 Praetorian guards, the strongest men in the palace, held his shoulders and arms. They looked terrified. To restrain the emperor was treason. To let him thrash was death. Solon, the Greek physician, stood over the groin of the most powerful man in the world. He was sweating profusely. He knew that the line between savior and traitor was measured in millimeters of flesh. If he cut too deep, he would sever the femoral artery, and Galerius would bleed out in minutes. If he didn't cut deep enough, the pressure would remain, and Solon would be executed for incompetence. "Bite," Solon commanded. A block of soft wood was jammed between Galerius's teeth. He bit down so hard the wood instantly splintered. Solon did not hesitate. He couldn't afford to. He drove the scalpel into the swollen, angry mass of the ulcerated region. The sound was not a squelch, but a hiss, like a tire being punctured. The pressure release was immediate and violent, but it was not clear fluid that erupted. It was a slurry of pus, blood, and necrotic tissue. The smell hit the room like a physical blow. One of the guards gagged, turning his head away, his eyes watering. Galerius did not scream initially. The shock was too great. His body went rigid, every muscle locking into a spasm of tetany. Then, the sound tore from his throat, a guttural, animalistic roar that bypassed the wood in his mouth and echoed down the marble corridors of the palace. It was the sound of a soul being evicted. Solon worked frantically. He wasn't performing delicate surgery. He was digging a trench. He had to create a drainage channel for the infection that had pooled deep in the pelvic floor. He sliced through layers of inflamed skin and fascia. "More sponges!" he yelled. Slaves rushed forward with sea sponges soaked in vinegar, mopping up the deluge. The blood was dark, almost black, a sign of poor oxygenation and sepsis. But the horror had only just begun. As Solon probed deeper, trying to reach the source of the blockage, he encountered resistance. The tissue wasn't just swollen, it was hard. The infection had caused a massive buildup of scar tissue and granuloma. "I have to go deeper," Solon muttered to himself, his hands slick with imperial blood. He grabbed a pair of bronze forceps. He inserted them into the incision and began to pull. Galerius convulsed. The guards struggled to hold him. The bed frame creaked under the strain of his thrashing. The pain was beyond the capacity of the nervous system to process. It was blinding white light. Solon managed to extract a mass of necrotic flesh, dropping it into a metal basin with a wet thud. But as he did, he realized the futility of his task. The infection wasn't a contained abscess. It was diffuse. It had spread like the roots of a tree, wrapping around the urethra, the rectum, the intricate network of veins and nerves. "It is everywhere," Solon whispered. He packed the wound with raw wool and salt, a primitive antiseptic that burned like liquid fire. Galerius passed out from the pain, his head lolling to the side, his breathing ragged and shallow. The surgery was over, but it was a failure. They had drained the surface, but the core of the rot remained. When Galerius awoke hours later, the fever had spiked. He was delirious. The trauma of the surgery had sent his body into shock, but worse than the pain was the realization that the blockage was still there. He still could not pass waste. The pressure in his abdomen was unrelenting, and now there was a new complication. The open wound in his groin, created by Solon's knife, was a gateway. In the humid, unsanitary conditions of the ancient world, it was an open invitation to every pathogen in the room. The wound did not heal. It began to widen. The edges turned black. 3 days after the surgery, a new physician arrived. He was an older man, experienced in the battlefields of the frontier. He took one look at the wound and stepped back, crossing himself. A reflex he quickly hid. "What is it?" the Praetorian prefect demanded. "Gangrene," the physician said softly. "But not just gangrene. It is eating him." The medical term we use today is Fournier's gangrene, a necrotizing fasciitis of the perineum. It is one of the most aggressive, fast-moving, and lethal infections known to medicine. The bacteria release toxins that destroy tissue at a rate of inches per hour. The butcher's surgery had failed to cure the emperor. Instead, it had accelerated his demise. It had opened the door to a microscopic army that was far more ruthless than any Persian legion. The wound began to weep a foul, gray fluid. The skin around the incision started to bubble, crepitus, as gas-producing bacteria multiplied under the surface. Galerius, in his moments of lucidity, looked down at his own body. He saw the blackness spreading across his thighs like ink on blotting paper. He realized, with a cold dread, that he was no longer a man. He was a corpse that had forgotten to die. "Bring me," he gasped, clutching the hand of a slave. "Bring me the priests. All of them." He didn't want a doctor anymore. He wanted a miracle. But the gods were silent, and the only sound in the room was the wet, bubbling noise of his own flesh dissolving. The palace was no longer a seat of power. It was a tomb, and the flies were beginning to gather. The palace of Serdica, once a marvel of Roman engineering and luxury, underwent a grotesque transformation. It ceased to be a residence for the living and became a container for a singular, overpowering presence. The smell. It was not merely the odor of sickness. It was a dense, physical miasma that clung to fabrics, seeped into the porous marble, and tasted like copper and spoiled meat in the back of the throat. It was the scent of a living man undergoing decomposition. The attendants, loyal as they were, began to falter. Guards posted at the door of the imperial chamber would rotate every hour, not out of vigilance, but because they would retch if they stood in the fumes any longer. Servants soaked their tunics in vinegar and rosewater, tying the cloth over their noses and mouths, but the stench bypassed these flimsy barriers. It was primal. It triggered the deepest evolutionary alarm bells in the human brain. Death is here. Run. Galerius was now isolated in a horrifying paradox. He was the emperor, the center of the world, yet he was untouchable. He lay in a pool of his own fluids, his lower body elevated on cushions that were changed hourly, but were instantly soaked again. The gangrene, unleashed by the surgeon's knife, had gone wild. It was no longer confined to the groin. The necrotizing fasciitis had climbed up his abdomen and down his thighs. The skin had turned a mottled kaleidoscope of bruising, purple, black, and a sickly, iridescent green. And then came the worms. It is a detail that ancient historians like Lactantius dwell upon with almost gleeful horror. But modern medicine confirms it as a grim reality of neglected necrotic wounds in non-sterile environments. The open, weeping craters in the emperor's flesh attracted flies. The green bottle fly, Lucilia sericata, can smell necrosis from miles away. They found their way into the bedchamber, buzzing through the heavy incense smoke, landing on the exposed, dying tissue. Within days, the wounds were alive. Galerius, delirious with fever, would wake screaming, clawing at his own legs. "They are eating me! Get them off! Get them off!" The physicians were paralyzed. To pick the maggots out one by one was impossible. There were too many, and in a twisted irony, the maggots were actually performing a service, eating the dead tissue. But the psychological horror of seeing one's own body consumed by vermin broke the emperor's mind. He ordered bonfires to be lit inside the room. He believed the smoke would drive the flies away. Great braziers of cedar and pine were dragged in, raising the temperature of the sick room to a stifling oven. The heat only accelerated the bacterial growth. The room became a humid, smoky hellscape, flickering with orange light, filled with the buzzing of flies and the moans of a dying tyrant. Imagine the sensory overload, the heat, the smoke, the blinding pain, the visual horror of seeing your own hip bone exposed because the flesh had sloughed away. Galerius began to hallucinate. He saw the faces of the Christians he had burned. He saw them standing in the corners of the room, not angry, but watching, waiting. "Why are you here?" he would rasp at the empty air. "I gave you to the fire. Why are you not ash?" The palace of flies became a prison of guilt. In the ancient worldview, sickness was rarely just biological. It was spiritual. A disease this specific, this humiliating, this consuming, it had to be a message. His body, which he had worshipped as an idol of strength, was now a public spectacle of weakness. He was rotting from the genitals up, a symbolic castration of his power. He, who had sterilized the empire of atheists, was now a breeding ground for filth. The servants began to whisper. They said the emperor was cursed. They said the God of the Christians had sent an invisible arrow. The whispers traveled from the slaves to the guards, from the guards to the city streets. "The emperor is rotting," the people said. "The beast is being consumed." Inside the room, the physicians tried one last desperate measure to stop the infestation. They made a paste of warm marrow and raw meat, placing it near the wounds to lure the worms out. It worked to an extent. The vermin swarmed the fresh meat, and the physicians would scoop them away in buckets. But for every bucket removed, more appeared. The source was deep inside. The corruption was internal. Galerius lay back, exhausted, tears streaming down his face into his matted beard. He was the most powerful man on earth, yet he was less than the worms that feasted on him. He had commanded legions. He had reshaped the map, but he could not command a single fly to leave him be. He looked at his hands, shaking, wasted, the skin paper-thin. He realized then that his iron will meant nothing. His decrees meant nothing. The flies were the new emperors of this room, and he was just their meal. Pain, when it becomes absolute, destroys reason. It erodes the higher functions of the mind, empathy, logic, patience, until only the reptilian brain remains. And the reptilian brain knows only two responses to a threat: flee or fight. Galerius could not flee. His legs were rotting logs tethered to the bed. So he chose to fight. But he could not fight the bacteria eating his flesh, nor the worms nesting in his wounds. He needed an enemy he could touch, an enemy he could break. He turned his gaze to the men standing at the foot of his bed. The medical community of the Roman East had been summoned. They came from the great schools of Alexandria and Antioch, men who had spent their lives studying Galen and Hippocrates. They arrived in Serdica expecting a challenge. They found a death sentence. By the 30th day, the imperial bedchamber had transformed from a hospital into a courtroom where the verdict was always guilty. Galerius lay propped up on pillows, his face a mask of gray sweat and fury. The pressure in his abdomen was now so great that his skin looked translucent, ready to split. The pain was a constant screaming noise in his head. "You!" he wheezed, pointing a trembling finger at a distinguished physician named Demetrius. "You said the swelling would go down with the moon." Demetrius stepped forward, his sandals slipping slightly on the floor that was slick with the humidity of the room. He was trembling. "Dominus, the humors are stubborn, the alignment of the stars." "The stars are silent," Galerius roared, the effort causing him to cough up blood. "It is you who are incompetent. You are not healing me. You are watching me die." The logic of the tyrant had taken over. If Galerius was the chosen of the gods, then his body was perfect. If his body was failing, it could not be his fault. It had to be the fault of the mechanics tending to it. Therefore, the failure was not biological. It was treasonous. "Take him," Galerius whispered. The Praetorian guards, faces stoic behind their helmet visors, stepped forward. They grabbed the physician by the arms. There was no trial. There was no appeal. Demetrius was dragged from the room, his pleas for mercy echoing down the marble hallway until they were abruptly cut short by the dull thud of a gladius. The remaining physicians in the room stood frozen, statues of terror. They realized with a dawning horror that they were trapped in a cage with a wounded, dying lion. To try to cure him was impossible. To fail was fatal. The purge began. It was a grim spectacle. One by one, doctors were brought forward to examine the rotting ruin of the emperor. They were given impossible tasks. Stop the smell, close the wound, make the bowels move. One physician, desperate to save his own life, suggested a radical cauterization with hot irons to seal the gangrenous flesh. Galerius agreed. The irons were heated until they glowed white. The smell of burning meat filled the room, overpowering even the scent of rot. Galerius screamed until his voice gave out, but the infection was too deep. The heat only destroyed more healthy tissue, feeding the fire of the gangrene. That physician was executed before the irons had even cooled. Another doctor, paralyzed by fear, simply stared at the wound and wept, unable to speak. Galerius took his silence for insolence. He was beheaded in the courtyard. The Iron Shepherd was culling his own flock. It was an act of supreme, impotent rage. He was trying to kill the disease by killing the men who named it. He believed that if he could just find the right doctor, the one with the magic touch, the nightmare would end. But he was running out of doctors. News spread through the empire. Physicians went into hiding. To be summoned to Serdica was to receive a death warrant. The roads to the capital were empty of healers. Eventually, the room grew quiet. The bustling team of experts was gone. The floor was stained not just with the emperor's fluids, but with the phantom blood of the men who had tried to save him. Galerius was left with only the lowest tier of slaves, men who knew nothing of medicine, who were simply there to change the bandages and endure the abuse. They moved like ghosts, eyes downcast, terrified that if they made eye contact, they would be next. The isolation was total. The emperor had killed the very hands that might have eased his passing. He lay in the center of a vast, silent empire, surrounded by guards who feared him and servants who loathed him. He realized then, in the fevered haze of the 35th day, that his power was a joke. He could order a man's head cut off, but he could not order his own sphincter to open. He was the master of life and death for everyone but himself. The paranoia deepened. He began to suspect that the doctors hadn't just failed, they had poisoned him. Yes, that was it. It was a conspiracy. The Christians, the Senate, the Persians, they had paid the doctors to let him rot. Spies, he muttered to the ceiling, his eyes darting back and forth. All of them, spies and assassins. He refused to eat the food brought to him, convinced it was laced with venom. He drank only water that he made his taster drink first, watching the slave for an hour to see if he died before taking a sip himself. He was starving, rotting, and alone. The executioner's blade had solved nothing. It had only left him in the dark, with no one to hold the lamp but the flies. The walls of the imperial palace were thick stone, built to withstand siege engines and fire, but they were porous to secrets, especially secrets that smelled like death. The emperor had executed the physicians to silence the truth, but he could not execute the air. The stench of the rotting god-king drifted out of the bedchamber, down the marble corridors, through the servant quarters, and out into the streets of Serdica. It was a heavy, sweet-sour odor that settled in the valley like a fog. When the wind blew from the palace, the citizens covered their faces, and with the wind came the whispers. The Iron Shepherd is falling apart, the market vendors muttered as they exchanged coins. The worms have taken the throne, whispered the slaves washing clothes by the river. The news traveled along the Roman roads faster than any imperial courier. It reached Nicomedia, Antioch, and Rome. But nowhere did it land with more impact than in the hidden, candlelit rooms of the Christians. For 10 years, they had been the hunted. They had seen their bishops beheaded, their scriptures burned, their families torn apart by wild beasts in the arena. They had lived in the shadow of Galerius's terror, praying for deliverance. Now, the deliverance had arrived, not in the form of an army, but as a microscopic scourge. Enter Lucius Caecilius Firmianus Lactantius. He was a scholar, a rhetorician, and a Christian convert who would become the primary chronicler of this nightmare. While Galerius lay dying, Lactantius picked up his quill. He did not write with sympathy. He wrote with the cold, righteous fury of a man watching justice being served. In his work, De Mortibus Persecutorum, on the deaths of the persecutors. Lactantius framed the disease not as a tragedy, but as a verdict. To the Christians, this was not random biology. It was precision engineering by the divine. Consider the symbolism, they argued. Galerius had ordered the destruction of the church, the body of Christ. Now his own body was destroying itself. He had stripped the Christians of their dignity. Now he was stripped of his own, lying naked and festering in his own waste. He had burned them with fire. Now he burned with a fever that no water could quench. The specific nature of the illness, starting in the genitals and consuming the bowels, was seen as the ultimate mockery. The seat of his virility, the source of his dynasty, had become the source of his doom. Lactantius wrote with a terrifying vividness. His bowels came out. His whole body became a seat of corruption. The stench filled not only the palace, but the whole city. He was eaten of worms, and his body dissolved into an intolerable anguish. These writings were not just history. They were psychological warfare. The Christians began to speak openly of the judgment of God. They no longer hid in the catacombs. They walked the streets with a quiet confidence, looking up at the palace windows where the smoke of the fumigation fires billowed out. He fought God, they said, and God broke him. Inside the sick room, Galerius was not immune to these whispers. The palace was a sounding board. He heard the guards talking in low tones when they thought he was asleep. He saw the way the servants looked at him, not with the fear of authority, but with the superstitious dread one feels when looking at a cursed object. He began to dream. In his delirium, the faces of the martyrs returned, but they were not screaming, they were praying, and their prayers were heavier than the stones of the palace. He realized, with a sinking, freezing sensation in his chest, that his transactional view of religion had failed. He had sacrificed hecatombs of bulls to Jupiter. He had poured rivers of wine to Mars. But Jupiter and Mars were silent. They had no jurisdiction over this rot. The God of the Christians, however, this God seemed to be very much present. Galerius was a man of war. He respected power. And as he watched his own flesh slough off his bones, as he felt the worms moving inside him, he was forced to admit that he was facing a power he could not kill with a sword. The Christian prophecy was self-fulfilling. The more he suffered, the more the populace believed in the power of the Christian God. The emperor became the greatest evangelist for the faith he tried to destroy. His agony was the sermon. On the 38th day, a brave advisor, perhaps the last one who dared to speak the truth, approached the bedside. He held a handkerchief over his nose. "Dominus," the advisor said softly. "The people say, they say this is the hand of the Galilean." Galerius turned his head. His eyes were sunken craters in a skull that was becoming visible beneath the melting skin. He tried to summon his rage. He tried to order the execution of everyone who spoke that name. But the energy was gone. The anger had been eaten by the pain. He looked at the advisor, and for the first time in his life, the Iron Shepherd looked small. "If it is their God," Galerius croaked, a bubble of blood bursting on his lips. "If it is their God who does this, then perhaps we must make a deal." The room went silent. The flies buzzed louder. The implications of his words hung in the air like smoke. The man who had vowed to erase the name of Christ from history was about to do the unthinkable. He was about to ask for his help. The prophecy was complete. The beast was broken. All that remained was the surrender. The 39th day brought a silence deeper than the grave. The screaming had stopped. The rage had evaporated. What remained in the imperial bedchamber was a man stripped of all illusions, left with nothing but the wet, squelching reality of his own demise. Galerius Valerius Maximianus, the master of the world, had come to a cold, transactional conclusion. The gods of Rome were bankrupt. He had spent his life operating on the logic of exchange. Do ut des, I give so that you may give. He had given Jupiter temples of marble. He had given Mars rivers of Persian blood. And when the sickness came, he had given the physicians gold. But the transaction had failed. The marble was silent. The blood was dry. The gold was useless. There was only one power left that he had not tried to negotiate with. The power he had spent 10 years trying to exterminate. Scribe, Galerius whispered. The word was barely audible, a wet friction of air passing through a throat constricted by inflammation. But in the quiet room, it sounded like a thunderclap. A young notary, pale and trembling, stepped out from the shadows. He held a wax tablet and a stylus, but his hands shook so violently he could barely hold them. He was terrified not just of the emperor, but of the air around him. The heavy, infectious miasma that felt like it was coating his lungs with grease. Right, Galerius commanded, his eyes fixed on the ceiling where the soot from the fumigation fires had stained the frescoes black. He did not have the strength to hold a pen. The hands that had once wielded the fasces were now swollen, purple mitts, useless and immobile. He had to dictate his surrender. The document that followed would change the course of human history. It was not born of mercy. It was not born of enlightenment or a sudden moral awakening. It was born of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a desperate plea from a man who was being eaten alive and was willing to sign anything to make it stop. Among our other arrangements for the benefit of the Republic, Galerius began, his voice rasping, forcing the scribe to lean in closer to the stench. We had formerly desired to bring all things into conformity with the ancient laws and public discipline of the Romans. Even in death, he clung to his justification. He refused to admit he was wrong. He was merely adjusting policy. He paused, gasping for air as a wave of nausea rolled over him. The worms in his lower abdomen shifted, a sensation of thousands of tiny needles moving under his skin. He gritted his teeth and continued. For this reason, that the Christians, who had abandoned the religion of their ancestors, should return to right opinions. He looked at the scribe. The boy was writing furiously, etching the words into the wax. But, Galerius said, the word hanging heavy in the air. But, since many of them have endured all manner of tribulations, and since we have seen that they neither pay the reverence due to the gods, nor worship the God of the Christians. This was the crux of his logic. By persecuting them, he had stopped them from worshiping their God, but they hadn't started worshiping his. The result was a spiritual vacuum, a hole in the universe where no prayers were being said. And Galerius believed this vacuum was what was killing him. He needed the prayers. He needed the spiritual voltage. We extend our most speedy indulgence to them, Galerius rasped, the words tasting like ash, that they may once more be Christians and rebuild their meeting places. The scribe stopped. He looked up, his eyes wide. He was old enough to remember the edicts of burning. He had seen the smoke of the churches. Now, the man who lit the match was ordering the rebuilding. "Write it!" Galerius hissed, a sudden flare of his old fire returning for a fleeting second. "Provided they do nothing contrary to public order." And then came the bargain. The desperate, pathetic hook upon which the emperor hung his last hope of survival. "Wherefore, for this our indulgence, They ought to pray to their God for our safety, for that of the Republic, and for their own, that the Republic may continue uninjured on every side, and that they may be able to live securely in their homes. Pray to their God for our safety. There it was. The Edict of Toleration, issued on April 30th, 311 AD. It was arguably the most humiliating document ever signed by a Roman emperor. He was legally recognizing the deity of his enemies and begging that deity for a cure. He was asking the victims of his torture chambers to get on their knees and intercede for his rotting soul. "Send it," Galerius whispered, his energy spent. "Send it to Nicomedia. Send it to Antioch. Send it to every province. Tell them to pray now." The scribe bowed low and fled the room, clutching the tablet like it was a live coal. Within hours, the runners were dispatched. The edict was posted in the public squares. The reaction was stunned silence, followed by disbelief. The prisons were opened. The chains were struck off. Men and women who had been awaiting execution in the mines and dungeons walked out into the sunlight, blinking, rubbing their scarred limbs. They gathered in the ruins of their churches, and they did exactly what the emperor asked. They prayed. But they did not pray to Jupiter. They prayed to the god who they believed had struck the tyrant down. Back in the palace, Galerius waited. He lay in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the city. He imagined the prayers rising like invisible smoke, traveling from the lips of the Christians, up through the spheres of the heavens, reaching the ear of the Galilean. He waited for the miracle. He waited for the swelling to subside. He waited for the worms to die. He waited for the cool wash of divine forgiveness to cleanse his blood. He closed his eyes and focused on his body. Was it working? Was the pressure easing? A sharp, tearing pain ripped through his intestines, followed by the wet, bubbling sound of gas escaping through the necrotic fistula. The smell intensified. The transaction was complete. The edict was signed. The Christians were free. But the rot remained. Galerius stared into the dark corners of the room, where the shadows seemed to twist and mock him. He realized then the final crushing truth. The God of the Christians might be real, and he might be powerful. But he was not a merchant. He could not be bribed with a signature. The desperate bargain had saved the church, but it would not save the emperor. The 40-day timer was ticking down to zero. The biology of his collapse was irreversible. The walls of his own body were breaching, and no amount of prayer could hold back the flood. He had ended the war on Christianity, but the war inside his gut was entering its final, catastrophic phase. The miracle did not come. The sun rose over Serdica on the 5th of May, 311 AD. The prayers of the Christians had been offered. The edict was law, but the laws of biology were far older and far more rigid than the laws of Rome. The transaction had been rejected. Galerius lay in the wreckage of his bed. He was no longer waiting, he was drifting. The pain, which had been a screaming, high-pitched frequency for 40 days, had changed. It had deepened, becoming a dull, rhythmic thrumming, like the beating of a massive, dark drum. His body had reached the structural limit of human tissue. The explosion that history whispers about was not a detonation of gunpowder, but something far more visceral. It was the catastrophic failure of containment. The gangrene, having eaten through the skin and muscle, had finally compromised the integrity of the intestinal wall. It happened in the quiet of the afternoon. There was no grand speech. There was no final curse. There was simply a sound, wet, tearing, and final. Deep inside the abdominal cavity, The distended bowel, stretched to the thickness of parchment paper by weeks of blockage and gas, ruptured. The contents of the intestine, the toxic, pressurized waste of 40 days, flooded into the sterile cavity of the peritoneum. The shock was instantaneous. It was a massive, systemic assault. The blood pressure plummeted as the body went into immediate septic shock. Galerius gasped. His eyes flew open, wide and unseeing. The agony of the rupture was so intense that it bypassed the pain receptors and registered simply as a white void. He arched his back, the muscles seizing one last time, fighting the inevitable collapse. The physicians huddled in the far corner heard the sound. They knew what it meant. The siege was broken. The walls had fallen. For the emperor, the world began to narrow. The gold of the ceiling frescoes turned to gray. The smell of the room, which had been his entire universe, began to fade, replaced by a cold, metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to speak. Perhaps he wanted to call for his guards. Perhaps he wanted to rescind the edict. Or perhaps he simply wanted water. But his tongue was a dry leaf in a drought. No sound came out. The Iron Shepherd, the man who had marched legions across the Euphrates, who had wrestled wolves in the snows of Dacia, was reduced to a singular, frantic heartbeat. Thump. He saw the faces of the Persian kings he had conquered. Thump. He saw the flames of the churches he had burned. Thump. He saw the vast, empty darkness that waited for him, a darkness where there were no titles, no legions, and no pain. The heart stopped. The chest heaved one last time, a rattle of air escaping the fluid-filled lungs, and then settled. The tension that had held the room captive for 6 weeks evaporated. Galerius Valerius Maximianus was dead. The silence that followed was heavy. For a long time, no one moved. The guards did not lower their spears. The slaves did not weep. The physicians did not rush forward to check for a pulse. They didn't need to. The presence that had filled the room, the sheer, overwhelming force of Galerius's will, was gone. What remained on the bed was not a god. It was not a monster. It was just a ruined shell, a biological tragedy that had finally run its course. The disposal of the body was swift and unceremonious. There would be no grand viewing. The condition of the corpse made a state funeral impossible. The smell was too great. The risk of infection too high. The man who wanted to be worshipped as a divinity was wrapped quickly in chemically treated linens and sealed in a lead-lined coffin to contain the corruption. History turned a page. The Edict of Toleration, signed in his final moments of terror, survived him. It paved the way for the Edict of Milan 2 years later, under Constantine, which would change the West forever. Galerius had intended to destroy Christianity. Instead, his death became the cornerstone of its victory. The death of the persecutor became a morality play, a story told for centuries to warn tyrants of the fragility of their power. But in the end, stripped of the politics and the theology, it is a story about the body. It is a reminder that no amount of gold can bribe a cell to stop dividing. No amount of authority can command a bacteria to stop feeding. We are, all of us, tenants in a vessel of flesh, and when the lease is up, the landlord is ruthless. The flies dispersed. The fires in the room were extinguished. The windows were thrown open, and the fresh, cool air of the Danube Valley rushed in, chasing away the shadows of the 40 days. The nightmare was over. Now I want you to take a deep breath. Let the heavy, dark air of the history we just explored drift away. Visualize the smoke of the palace clearing, carried off by a gentle wind. The story of Galerius is intense, full of pain and noise. But that noise happened 2,700 years ago. It is gone. The palace of Serdica is now dust. The screams have long since faded into the quiet hum of the earth. The iron swords have rusted into the ground, returning to the soil from which they came. Think about the silence that follows a storm. That is where we are now. The struggle is finished. There is a deep, profound peace in knowing that time washes everything away. All the ambitions, all the fears, all the frantic grasping for control, it all eventually settles into the quiet archives of the past. You are here, in the present. You are safe. Your body is at rest. You don't need to carry the weight of empires or the worry of tomorrow. Just for this moment, let yourself float in the river of time. It flows slowly, gently, smoothing the rough edges of history into soft stones. Listen to the rhythm of your own breathing, in and out, slow and steady, like the turning of the pages of a very old, very heavy book. We close the cover on the story of the emperor. We put it back on the shelf. The library is dark, cool, and silent. The stars that look down on Serdica are the same stars that are watching over you tonight. They are calm, distant, and unchanging. Let their light be a blanket. Let the darkness be a comfort, not a fear. It is time to rest your eyes. It is time to let the history sleep. Good night, everyone. See you in the next episodes.